When you picture the skies of World War II, what do you see? Spitfires dueling Messerschmitts, vast fleets of B-17 bombers, maybe the iconic C-47 Skytrain dropping paratroopers over Normandy. But what about helicopters? It might surprise you to learn that these indispensable machines of modern warfare were just beginning to take flight. During the largest conflict in human history, while fighters and bombers dominated the headlines, a quiet revolution was happening in the background. The United States was the only nation to use helicopters in any significant way during World War II, and even then, their role was tiny, experimental, and far from the front lines of combat. Yet, these fragile, pioneering aircraft planted the seeds for the future of military aviation. So today, let's explore every U.S. helicopter used in World War II. A short but incredibly important chapter in the story of flight. In the early 1940s, the helicopter was still a technological curiosity. Most countries saw them as interesting but impractical gadgets, not serious military tools. The core problem was that helicopters were incredibly complex, and the technology, especially engine power and reliability, just wasn't there yet. Fixed-wing aircraft were faster, could carry more, and were far more reliable and understood. But the United States, thanks in large part to the vision of one man, saw a glimmer of potential. That man was Igor Sikorsky, a Russian-American aviation pioneer who is often called the father of the modern helicopter. His work convinced the U.S. military to invest in this unproven technology, and while several experimental models were built, only one type of American helicopter would actually see operational service before the war ended. That helicopter was the Sikorsky R-4. It holds the unique and historic title of being the world's first mass-produced helicopter and the only Allied helicopter to serve in World War II. Its first flight was in 1942, and by 1944, it was entering service with the U.S. Army Air Forces, the Navy, and the Coast Guard. The military gave it a few different names. The Army called it the R-4, while the Navy and Coast Guard designated it the HNS-1. Now, when you look at an R-4, you have to forget everything you know about modern helicopters like the Apache or Black Hawk. The R-4 was a delicate, almost skeletal machine. It had a single three-bladed main rotor and was powered by a small radial engine that produced less than 200 horsepower. It's crucial to remember that the R-4 was never a combat helicopter. It carried no guns and was never intended to fly into a firefight. Because of this timing, it never saw operational service during the conflict, but its development was entirely a product of the wartime push. It featured an enclosed, streamlined fuselage which improved its aerodynamics, and it was engineered for better reliability and easier maintenance. It was a more mature design that showed how quickly helicopter technology was evolving under the pressures of war. Though not a World War II veteran itself, its DNA was forged in the conflict. So we have the R-4 as the only operational helicopter, and the R-5 and R-6 as designs that were born from the war but arrived just a little too late. But were there any others? Yes, there were several other experimental helicopters being developed in the U.S. during the war, but none of them came close to the success of Sikorsky's designs. For example, there was the WWII XR-1. This was an interesting design that used two large rotors mounted on side-by-side pylons, a configuration you see today on aircraft like the Chinook. While the concept was sound, the XR-1 was plagued by mechanical complexity and stability problems. Then there was the Kellett XR-8, which used a system of two intermeshing rotors that spun in opposite directions. This design, known as a syncropter, eliminated the need for a tail rotor. Again, it was a clever idea in theory, but in practice, it proved to be too complicated and unreliable for military service in the 1940s. These and other experimental models were important for research, but they couldn't compete with the relative simplicity and effectiveness of Igor Sikorsky's single-main rotor and tail rotor design, which became the standard for helicopters for decades to come. So, why were helicopters so rare in World War II? It really came down to a few key factors. First, engine technology was still in its infancy. The engines of the era were heavy and didn't produce enough power to lift significant weight, severely limiting the helicopter's payload and range. Second, they were mechanically complex and suffered from constant reliability issues. They required a huge amount of maintenance compared to fixed-wing aircraft. And finally, military doctrine simply hadn't caught up. Generals and tacticians were still figuring out how to best use this new type of aircraft. For the primary wartime tasks of bombing, fighting, and large-scale transport, airplanes were simply a much better solution. But the legacy of that handful of Sikorsky R-4 South is immeasurable. Though they played a statistically minor role in the grand scheme of World War II, their impact echoed for generations. They proved, beyond any doubt, that helicopters were not just a novelty. They were viable military aircraft with a unique and life-saving capability. They demonstrated that they could go where no airplane could, plucking soldiers from impossible situations and changing the calculus of survival on the battlefield. The lessons learned from the R-4's daring rescue in Burma and its service with the Coast Guard directly shaped post-war military strategy. This led to the widespread adoption of helicopters for medical evacuation, or medevac, a role that would save countless lives in the wars to come, from Korea to Vietnam and beyond. The small, fragile helicopters of World War II were the first step on a journey that would transform the modern battlefield. They were the pioneers that flew into the unknown, proving what was possible and paving the way for the powerful and versatile aircraft that serve around the world today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, look into a lesser-known corner of aviation history. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the world of military tech and history. We'll see you in the next one.